Hello, Podcast Collective Consciousness. I hope all is well in your world. This is the Reconsider Simon podcast. In this audio space, I'll explore consciousness, ufology, high strangeness, the esoteric, spirituality, even the very essence of reality itself. Episode number 4, Lost and Suppressed Ancient Building Technology. Hello, I'm back. It's been an incredibly long time. I think previous podcasts I was revering the fact that I moved to a really energetic area, a village called Ditchling, and had all these amazing energy lines and stuff. But actually, in hindsight, some of the stuff that was going on was actually quite detrimental to my health. So hilariously, I now have an opposite opinion. I've had sort of problems with my health, and the new flat that I moved to, which is directly behind the church, which had a graveyard. Initially, I just feeling all this kind of energy, but I realised in hindsight, actually, it was kind of affecting my health quite negatively. So I made the executive decision to basically come back to live with some family just to kind of recover a bit. And it has actually meant that I've moved out of that flat in Ditchling. Now I'm sort of homeless, have my stuff in storage. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I haven't really recorded something for a while. But it also just spurred on ideas about placement of buildings and then how that kind of interacts with the human body, the human health. That kind of spurred on a whole load of questions in terms of like ancient architecture and lost and suppressed technologies, etc. I kind of started to look at that and then realized the topic was really too broad. So I've kind of narrowed it down. So I guess with this audio piece, I'm purely going to look at, lost and suppressed architecture. The idea that potentially some of the really ancient buildings that we know of may, apart from just being a place of shelter or, a tomb for a particular king, maybe, or a religious building, maybe there was something more to it that was happening, whether it would be energy generation, like spiritual initiation, a whole host of reasoning. So are we looking at kind of ancient architecture in an incorrect way? So that's going to be the driving force of this audio piece. I guess a lot of this information I'm going to be looking at today, there's always a lot of speculation involved, a lot of theories. So some of the stuff might be quite wild. I just tried to look at it with completely fresh eyes and really have no preconceptions about how, potentially buildings worked and, how much we've been potentially misled about some of the functions of these places. Um, yeah, what's interesting is that actually originally when I, left home and then went to university at the time, I was doing a thing called interior architecture in Brighton, which was essentially like architecture. It sounds like it's interior design, but it was architecture, but it was more to designing of interior spaces, but it was essentially architecture. And it was pretty highly conceptual, which is kind of the aspect of the course that I really, really liked. But the kind of pragmatic approach of creating technical drawings of buildings and floor plans was less exciting to me, which is weird because obviously that's the main emphasis of the course I was doing. But one of the big questions we always were asked by the teachers, what is architecture? You need to define it. And we would always groan at this kind of question. And, we have a modern day understanding and definition of what architecture is. And in the dictionary, it states as being the art or practice of designing and constructing buildings. And then you can then explore that more and look at the word building. What does that mean? A structure with a roof and walls, such as a house or factory. So, these buildings have very practical uses, for shelter, for functions for you to live in, or to, create commerce in, as with the factory. And then you can have a collection of buildings, can't you? And that starts to form a community. So you can have like a hamlet, which in the British sense is, a very small collection of buildings, small collection of families or people. And then one up from there, you have a village, and then a town, and then a city. And then cities, by the old school kind of definition, used to be defined that you actually had a cathedral in the town itself that would make you a city. But obviously, modern day, uh, we tend to kind of base that off population. I've no idea what the threshold is to be a city, but that's the general rule of thumb across the world. And then obviously you can then combine these collections of towns and cities, and these forms an entire country. So it's interesting how these placements of buildings kind of are the epicenter of these communities. But then also a lot of these buildings, their pure function is for shelter, keep you away from the elements, keep you healthy, and keep you warm, etc. Or if you're in a hot environment, obviously keep you cool. And they're very much places where you can go to learn, gain education, and then also, spiritual kind of advancement, whether it would be a church or another area of kind of worship. So I guess, buildings are literally three-dimensional, but in a metaphysical sense, they're very three-dimensional. They're very sort of pragmatic in the way that we view them, the way that we interact with them. Again, it's just a boundary from the outside world that which allows us to sleep, live, learn, and work at a basic level. And I guess in kind of metaphysical ideas, it's quite unconsciously made. It's consciously made to be very practical, but that's where the kind of the function sort of stops. But from a modern day sort of traditional standpoint, we view buildings and architecture as having walls and a roof. But then you can start to look at sort of ancient areas, places which have a collection of forms of objects, maybe like a stone circle, which creates space in a way. It doesn't have a roof, so it's not a place you inhabit, but it is creating some kind of ecosystem. And obviously, what that was used for was it's still quite unclear whether it was harnessing particular energies, spiritual advancement, or it was tracking the constellations of the stars, etc. So that's all a bit hazy, but it could be argued that that is a piece of architecture because it's creating some kind of space, even though it doesn't involve a roof itself. So in a way, these ancient buildings or like stone circles start to work on more of a like a five-dimensional level because it's going beyond the idea of like providing shelter or a place to inhabit. It's potentially maybe harmonizing people's health. It's healing them. It could also do the same thing for the surrounding land as well. It can help people access other realms of consciousness. And also later on, look at the ideas of maybe even energy generation as well, how maybe it's harnessing the Earth's energy and also atmospheric energy to kind of create energy itself. Or are they transmitters of energy? And even wilder than that, I mean, are these potential like forms of transport, like Stargate travel technology? I mean, there are elements to these kind of architectural spaces that are quite old that we still don't understand from my point of view. And obviously, we have a certain amount of programming from our culture, which sort of tells us not to think that way, not to look at these buildings in that way. But obviously, a lot of these paradigms are completely disintegrating at the moment. So I think it's important to look at everything with completely fresh eyes. If you start to look at some of these ancient architecture, take the pyramids, for example, and look at it maybe, not purely as a structure to house like a tomb for a king or, or any other kind of ancient building, and look at it as a piece of technology in a way. And from a mainstream point of view, we've always been told that at the moment we're at the peak of modernity and consciousness, and you know, previous what comes before thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, obviously people were less developed, but now we're the kind of the peak of development at the moment. And I would hugely dispute that. But the point of view of technology evolution started with, what would say would like be wind and water, and then horse-drawn operating of vehicles as well, and then moving through to kind of combustion technology, such as the external combustion engine, which is essentially a engine, and then that changed into an internal combustion engine, which is diesel or petrol engines, which we still use to this day. But then obviously the prevalence now, the dominant technology that what I'm able to record this on at the moment, obviously send that across the world is electrical technology. That's the prevalence now. And so when we think of the word technology, we think a lot of the time to do with like electronics. And it's interesting to think, maybe there's another version of technology that we're not aware of or we don't really understand yet, which is, the harnessing through the use of natural materials like stone, metals, placed in particular areas on the earth, using particular form and structure to harness the ley lines, to harness cosmic forces, to harness atmospheric energy, to create something like whether that's energy or spiritual advancement or enable people to kind of move into other realms. So potentially you can start to look at sort of ancient forms of buildings or like older buildings being quite consciously created, like there's something else that's informing their shape and form and the materials that are used. And at the moment, we're very unconsciously doing stuff. I mean, obviously, we give stuff shapes and forms, but it's all for aesthetic reasons. And then also, let's not forget there's nefarious forces in the world as well. Are our urban environments being purposely created to kind of create disharmony for humanity? And are there more esoteric reasons why this is happening? I guess over the last 10 years, I've just started to understand really how detrimental modern architecture is really to human health and human consciousness. And, you know, obviously within architecture at the moment, you can get beautiful buildings through that look amazing in an amazing landscape, don't get me wrong. But a lot of the time, these things I think are being created very unconsciously. And what's interesting when I like reflect back at my course that I did, again, I mentioned it was quite conceptual, it was very artsy, and so there was a certain amount of conscious involved in that. It wasn't just, oh, I'm just going to place this building here with no reverence to the land around it or the community. There was kind of deep thought that went into, the ideas that you created. As an example, one of the projects I did in my second year was called, it was in an area in Brighton called Southwick. And it was quite industrial. It was right on the seafront. They had this disused building there. And the project was to come up a new use for this building. And I went there and it was a particularly kind of um, wet day. The waves were crashing, the wind was howling. It was this big spectacle of nature. It felt like theatre to me. And that idea of like theatre really then informed this derelict building. I decided, okay, well, I'm going to put like a community theatre in there. So, it's interesting how that, the placement of the building and what's going on around it really informed the function of that building. So there is, like I mentioned, there's a certain amount of consciousness involved in some of these architectural projects on an educational level. And I did similar projects. There was one other one in Folkestone in my final year. And again, it was quite a rundown area. And it was the whole idea of the project was, what are you going to place in this area that's kind of run down to help the community? And it had all these really interesting views from the top of the hill. And so my idea was to kind of put this market there on different levels so people could walk around the market whilst also kind of enjoying the various kind of fragmented views. So it's quite sort of community focused. But unfortunately, I think a lot of the time within the commercial sector, like all of those ideas are like completely lost. Obviously, it's all about the bottom line. It's about making money. Um, Majority of the times, it's not about the reverence for the community around it, the landscape, the story. It's just about money, you know. So the usual commercial story is that everyday housing, shops, factories, some public buildings, you have a developer and they have a need to kind of make money. And so they'll design something and maybe they will have a good budget, maybe with the public buildings where they can try and make something nice that's has prosperity, maybe lasts, 100 years, 50 years, whatever. But a lot of the times it is all to do with profit. And it's that drive for profit and that drive to sort of save money. It is entirely possible a lot of the time to design buildings that cool itself or heat itself in a very natural way. But a lot of the time that never gets installed into a building or design baked into the design because it'll cost too much. It's a lot easier just to design what they want from a functional point of view. Maybe it looks quite nice, but then just put the air conditioning things on the outside or the heating boiler or furnace on the inside and let the eventual owner deal with the costings. So with building design and architecture in general, has this paradigm always been like this? We have we been making these structures unconsciously forever, or have we lost something through just amnesia? We just forgot as a species, we just kind of lost this knowledge, or is there something darker going on here? Is there a concerted effort to reset and suppress some of this information about making these buildings more than just places to inhabit and to live in? that they are creating healing, that they can create energy on their own, they can create spiritual advancement. But even darker than that is this hidden knowledge that's held by particular forces within this world, weaponizing some of this hidden suppressed knowledge against us. As humanity tries to develop spiritually, tries to develop consciously, are some of the places that we're inhabiting, like cities and buildings, designed in a way really to sort of prevent us from reaching those higher levels of consciousness. So you can really come to the conclusion now that the idea, the very word architecture or building, the definition really needs to be updated. These can be mechanisms for healing, spiritual advancement again, stabilizing the landscape, purifying the landscape around, detoxifying the soil, nurturing of growth of, crops and plants and vegetation around, energetically healing the land as well. So it's not just a physical thing, like it's actually working on more of a spiritual level, increasing that connection between humanity and the earth. And all these ideas have been potentially hidden from us from, hundreds, if not thousands of years. More worryingly, at the moment, you have forces like the World Economic Forum, which is actually pushing humanity to inhabit more densely populated places, creating smart cities, 50-minute cities. Um, they're all internet enabled. So every service, every aspect of your life is kind of being utilized by the internet and Wi-Fi radiation and EMF radiation. And so not only are you living in these quite cramped conditions, but you're being bathed in this kind of electromagnetic field, which is obviously incredibly detrimental to the human body. So we have this quite modern day dystopian worrying idea of these smart cities, but what has come before, what technologies would we have before? One of the big ones and obvious answers would be the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. And the pyramid as a form and shape is repeated across the world. You find it in Mexico. More controversially, people said there's pyramid in Bulgaria and some in China as well. So yeah, overall, the pattern of the pyramid shape is found all over the world, and even more out there. People have ideas that the pyramids are being found on Mars, etc. as well. So it's a common form, common geometry. So the current alternative thinking for the pyramids in Giza are that they could be places of initiation, spiritual initiation and healing, and also people perceive them as being harnessing energies purely based off the geometry or the placement of the pyramids and materials that they've used and the shape and form, through the manipulation of water and sound as well, potentially. So there's a lot of really quite interesting ideas surrounding the pyramids of Giza and actually what their function was. From a mainstream academic point of view, they perceive the pyramids as being tombs, roughly taking 20 years to make, involving 20,000 people using rudimentary tools. But there are a lot of theories that maybe the pyramids even predate the idea of Egyptian culture, and that the Egyptians, what we perceive as being the ancient Egyptians, were utilizing a building that was already there before them by a more advanced culture. And then there's loads of ideas like, how did they build this? Was this using advanced techniques or technology we just don't have access to? They have an understanding of science that we don't. Or was it they had outside help? Was a non-human intelligence actually helping build these pyramids? But it's very obvious, even from a very physical point of view, that they understood, sophisticated geometry and mathematics just due to the precision of everything. And the placement of some of these buildings and the accuracy is greater than the majority of all modern buildings at the moment. And actually, through using mainstream measuring devices, they can see that the pyramids are harnessing an incredible amount of magnetic energy. So this is kind of some of the energetic stuff they can see from a mainstream point of view. Because of the sophistication and its placement, its mathematics, you can start to look at the pyramids as being a type of machine because of the accuracy. Yeah, which it probably was. Predominant material used in the construction of pyramids in Egypt, but also around the world, is granite. And granite is an amazing conductor of electromagnetic energy. Also, what was found in Giza is the use of limestone as well in the inside of the pyramid and also on the outside. And limestone is a highly conductive material. And the precision of the cutting of the blocks of the limestone on the outside of the pyramid suggested they had advanced technology, and it went far beyond what we could even use on the space shuttles when they have the heat tiles. The precision cut of the limestone on the outside of the pyramid was greater than that. And because, again, of the precision of the cuts of the masonry, it really sort of points towards advanced technology rather than a hammer and a chisel. Or someone was telling me once that they cut the blocks using horsehair, which seemed quite crazy. It's like, how can you do that accurately? And so they had access to really advanced masonry techniques, obviously. So with the pyramids of Giza, there's also a series of rooms inside and also tunnels. Some of them are really deep underneath the pyramids itself. The kind of the structure of the pyramid you see on the surface is not half of it. It's part of an overall larger structure that also goes underground and includes a network of water tunnels, which originally would have redirected water directly from the River Nile. And because of this, many speculate that the pyramids were a type of free energy device. But there's many people, theorists and scientists and archaeologists, that disagree on how this actually happened. Were the pyramids harnessing earth energies or atmospheric cosmic currents to create energy? Or is it through the use of water and solar energy mechanisms for energy generation? At the moment, I mean, we're having this huge electrical revolution with kind of electric cars, etc. And batteries are a big part of that. And you can get what are called saltwater batteries, which produce electricity, produce energy, but they can be quite large. That's why a lot of the time battery technology at the moment apparently is surrounding lithium, because these can be a lot more compact in size and then can store energy in a smaller area. So were the pyramids being utilized as some form of saltwater battery? I mean, that is something to consider. Some of those theories do hold weight because people have described what looked like electrical symbols, on the inside of the pyramids, and then which have been painted, and then also various locking and hook mechanisms have also been found, which people have theorized that may be electrodes, which can be locked in place like an anode or a cathode. So there is potential like leads in terms of that idea of there being some form of like energy battery. And because it has so many water tunnels underneath the pyramid, is that harnessing of salt water and fresh water also part of that mechanism of energy generation? You can start to look at the pyramids from a Tesla point of view. He was all about energy drawn from the ether, from the 0 point. And some people have perceived and theorized that maybe the Queen's Chamber was used as some kind of energy collector because it had a highly polished white limestone on the inside. And limestone, again, is a very powerful insulator and can store power. And so you can maybe look at the opposing energies from the sky and the earth, from the ley lines, giving this continuous energy generation, which is then stored in the stone in some of these chambers. So that's another theory as well. And some have found what they think are traces of cables and other structures, which again have been theorized as maybe being some kind of grounding mechanism. So again, you have this continuous charge from the ley lines and the connection between the sky and earth, creating this energy from the planet itself. Acoustics and sound. Many people have said that acoustics have been highly considered in the pyramids within these internal chambers and internal tunnel system. And they have many chambers, obviously different sizes, different shapes, and all of these chambers produce different sound frequencies. So you can sing and chant in different rooms, and it creates different frequencies. And again, is that part of the technology? Is there something we're missing with that as well in terms of sound frequency? The basis of sound is obviously frequency. And even with like modern day technology, they can see there's a lot of different concentrations of energy through the structure. The energy concentration is highest at the top of the building. And some of the frequencies emanating from the pyramids are incredibly low frequency sounds, which can actually even pass through stone. So this begs the question, is the pyramid acting as some kind of transmitter because some of these frequencies are being projected out through the stone out into the environment surrounding? So far, we've really looked at the pyramids in terms of the shape, the form, the materials, but there's another huge aspect to this in terms of the actual location of where it is in the land, where it is on planet Earth, and is that part of the function of the building, where it's located. And it is weirdly located on the longest line of latitude and also longitude as well. It's 30 degrees longitude and 30 degrees latitude. So again, how would the ancient Egyptians have this type of knowledge? And then the reflection of the shape and the form, it's 1/12 of the Earth's circumference. And again, how would they know that? They obviously baked in the geometry of the Earth into the pyramid itself. There are researchers out there that make a connection between Egypt and the pyramids and their technologies and Atlantis, the idea, the lost civilization of Atlantis. And obviously, their whole civilization was destroyed either by natural causes or by some kind of man made catastrophe. But you had all these people leaving that area with this incredibly advanced knowledge and then landing in Egypt and basically recreating some of this technology there. It could be that, the area of Egypt and the Giza pyramid is one of the key remaining activated points, with some ideas that the pyramids could be some kind of possible stargate, which then goes way beyond the idea of energy, harnessing energy. That is actually some form of transportation device as well. And don't forget, there's a lot of ideas in terms of like we're coming out this quite the age of Pisces, this quite dark period of humanity. And we're coming into what is called the age of Aquarius, and more of a utopian society where the consciousness is rising, etc. In order for some of these ancient architectural technologies to work, maybe we need to be in a more energetic space. So as we've come out the age of Pisces and we're into the age of Aquarius, maybe there's more spiritual energy that these buildings or architectural structures can be activated and operate how they should be because the energy's there where the energy hasn't been there before. In terms of ideas of Atlantis, there's no real physical like evidence of it that we know of, such as buildings, etc. It's all scattered information, from scriptures or oral history, a lot of channeled information as well, kind of coming through these days from people with having past lives, etc. There's a figure called Edgar Casey who used to get in a trance-like state, and he would provide people with medical healing or give them a list of instructions how to heal from various conditions. But people would also pay him to basically impart his wisdom, talking about some historical events. And he went at great length to describe Atlantis, and he would describe advanced technologies, harnessed through buildings, water, crystal technologies, and also genetics. Some of the information concerning why Atlantis, just disappeared, like what happened, and some perceive as the fact they got so out of control with their technology, what they were doing. They were really bending the forces of nature. And some perceived that there was some force that decided to create some kind of reset to destroy this civilization because they'd lost their way so much. Also, there's a school of thought that it was a completely natural disaster as well, and they maybe even brought it upon themselves through misuse of technology. So it'd be incredibly prudent for humanity at the moment to take stock and maybe think, the direction we're going with technology at the moment, is it good? What could be the consequences, which is obviously not happening at the moment. Another mythical civilization which is gaining a lot of traction at the moment are ideas to do with Tartaria. This is a subject matter I'm not totally well versed on. I've done some very superficial reading. I've seen a few videos and listened to podcasts where they discuss some of these concepts. But this whole subject really is gaining a lot of popularity on the internet. And it ties in a lot of the ideas of, similar to Atlantis, of having great resets, which again is very prevalent with the World Economic Forum conversation as well, and their talk about a great reset. And Tartaria is mentioned on quite a few ancient or old maps, and a lot of people speculate that they have these things called mud floods, which is kind of part of the whole reset process, a mechanism where it just resets the whole civilization again. And so some of the buildings around the world that are very opulent in various countries could be older than we actually think. And the original purpose and function is a lot more sophisticated than we're actually, given to believe. A lot of this is kind of speculation, but there's a growing movement and researchers are kind of looking into this area. Whether the concept of Tartaria is true or not, it's very interesting speculation that's happening at the moment. And some of these ideas that are percolating up through the collective. Whereas looking at buildings as not just places of shelter and gathering, but potentially, again, energy generating, self-sustaining, and also enhancing spirituality as well. And maybe, again, wild ideas of like creating transportation technology as well. And all of this technology is the result of harnessing amplification, movement, and utilization of beneficial energy, whether that comes from solar, the sun's particle energy, or directly from the land itself. Another offshoot, quite interesting offshoot of Tartaria, is looking at the world fairs that happened around the turn of the 20th century. And at the time, it was defining a lot of the technology and culture that was to come. And some of the imagery, the photographs that were taken, sort of depict incredibly elaborate buildings. And weirdly, some of these buildings look very, very extremely opulent. And then they were only up for a short period of time, and then they were seemingly just taken down after a very short period. And only a few of these buildings actually survive. Plus, a lot of the photography shows heavy use of water, water fountains, pond areas, etc. So the question people are asking is like, why spend so much time and so much energy creating these really sophisticated, opulent buildings to then seemingly just tear them down after a short period of time? And there's also a load of other weird anomalies that people have highlighted. It might not be nothing. It might be just coincidence, but just the sheer number of orphans that are around at the time, which people are speculating sort of points towards like a great reset, like lots of the adults potentially died off and there's just all these children left. It gets quite mad, actually, some of the ideas, and I'm not discounting it. I'm just sort of conveying the sort of the broad brushstrokes of it as well. And then also, there's a huge prevalence of insane asylums across the United Kingdom and also other areas of the Western world. And, why was that? Was it genuine that there was so many kind of people with mental health issues at that time, or was there something deeper going on? That a speculation is that some of these people, were part of the old civilization and essentially put in the asylums to sort of keep them hidden away. Again, this could be quite a stretch for most people's imagination, but it's an interesting variable to consider, just to not completely discount it as reality. Now coming back closer to home, the United Kingdom, British Isles, has a huge prevalence of old churches and cathedrals scattered across the landscape. And, that's the same for much of Europe as well. And these, buildings, obviously, from our understanding at the moment, they're perceived as being places of worship, places of Christianity, whether that would be Protestant or Roman Catholic. But the predominant activity in there is all to do with sound, isn't it? And a lot of them have bells. Even the smaller churches would have a bell. The cathedrals have a multitude of bells. And then a lot of them would have large organs in there as well. And then there'll be the whole practice of singing hymns as well. So a huge aspect of these buildings is all to do with sound. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this already, a thing called cymatics, which is obviously the kind of science of looking at sound. This Swiss physician called Hans Jenny was able to visualize sound by vibrating with certain frequencies through a plate, like a dark plate. And then it would have a scattering, a film of sand on top. And then depending on the frequency, the sand on the vibrating plate would then rearrange into complex geometry. And obviously that's just showing you on a 2D plane, but we can't see with 3D because there's obviously the sound is not visible. But it just details that axonometric cut through the sound geometry. And you can imagine 3D, that would be quite a complex 3D shape just from the sound itself. Now, there's a cymatic link potentially to cathedrals and churches, interestingly. There was a lady called Tanya Harris, and she went around various cathedrals and actually recorded silence in the cathedrals itself. And then she took the recordings back to a studio, amplified the recordings, and then played it back through water and light that was shining through the water. And then the sound kind of obviously affected the water, and you could see similar patterns, similar geometry to the cymatics. And what is really interesting is that some of the patterns and shapes that were created when she audibly put this noise through the water, it looked very much like the stained glass windows, the round rose stained glass windows that you get in cathedrals predominantly. So already the architects and the makers of these amazing buildings throughout Europe, we look at cathedrals and churches as being purely aesthetic, obviously understanding acoustics and how they obviously factored that into in the design, but there's a whole sphere, potentially a layer that we don't see and don't understand, which is to do with sound and geometry, cymatics, and their understanding of this and the healing power of it as well, and how it actually informs the design itself. Also, I'm pretty sure that when Tanya Harris recorded these sounds in the cathedral and amplified it through the water and the light, that they very much correlated the geometry that was created in the water, the patterning, very much correlated to what the rose stained glass window looked like in that specific church or cathedral. Again, double check that. But yeah, that's amazing if that's correct. But then also looking at the key elements of sound created within a cathedral or church. You look at the bells. I mean, a lot of the time they're perceived to be point of communication. So the bells would ring on Sunday morning, calling out to people to come to church. Or potentially if it was a special occasion, the bells would be ringing for that as well. But is there a deeper reason for these bells that exist? Obviously, you get different sizes, different tones. Was there a reason for this that goes beyond purely just for signaling out to people that, these frequencies could affect the human body in some way, whether that be healing or spiritual advancement? And again, some of the older cathedrals have these really quite sophisticated, old, large organs as well, with a multitude of different notes and sounds that can be created. And again, you got to wonder, is a deeper meaning behind the use of this technology that goes beyond purely, creating a noise so people can sing along to with their hymns? Is there a deeper understanding and reasoning behind these organs? And like the pyramids, really, are in the situation where we have all these old buildings and ancient architecture, which isn't really operating the way it should do because maybe it's been modified or it's been damaged. Again, it could be this situation where the spiritual, the cosmic energies aren't there to be harnessed because obviously we're coming out of an age of quite, dark period of human history. But then it's not just buildings potentially that aren't being utilized correctly. Some of these ancient old cities, maybe like London, even Brighton, where I used to live before, it's got a lot of tunnels underneath it as well. And again, this is kind of complete, pure speculation. But there's a deeper reason behind this, is for moving water for spiritual purposes, energetic purposes, rather than for, basic utilities for people to drink or to use in fountains. There's a deeper understanding of these tunnels. But in terms of shapes and forms and, potentially what that means and why they're like that, I mean, there's a lot of domed buildings, particularly religious buildings have these big domes. And then some of them have metal like aerials on the top. They could be crosses, they could be crescents, half moons, maybe stars. Again, you can maybe ponder whether some of these are receivers of atmospheric energy and whether then the shape of the dome itself then amplifies that kind of channeled energy from the atmosphere. And maybe some of this energy is then utilized in practical ways. It could be harnessed to regulate the temperature of the building or create light as well. And again, being utilized for healing of the human body and spiritual advancement is also another possibility. And going back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of developers these days and their remit and what kind of drives them to kind of construct these architectural like structures, and the fact that they a lot of the time just want to save money and just knock the cost further down the line. And so rather than kind of building design features with these buildings that kind of self-regulate in terms of heating and cooling, etc., they just stick air conditioning or heating units on the external of the building. And again, there's a larger thing to do with like building regulations and builders themselves. Obviously, they have all these rules, strict rules, which kind of stifles creativity and new ideas as well. So that's also a problem. Or getting slightly conspiratorial. I mean, you can maybe perceive that there are a certain cross-section of humanity that have access to this technology and understand this building technology. There is an interesting story from a guy called David Adair, who's been talking at length at the moment because he's coming towards the end of his life and he wants to disclose some of the information he has. But he was like a young rocket inventor and an absolute genius at the time. And the military sort of recognized his genius and actually took him to Area 51. And he claimed he was taken deep into the facility, like literally underground, into a deep underground base. And he was saying some of the technology he saw there within the base itself, within, the fabric of the building was amazing. And the whole area underground was just lit, and they had these huge hangars, these huge tunneling system, and it was all completely lit naturally, but there was no obvious light source. And again, he was speculating how that could happen, but it wasn't using incandescent bulbs or anything like that, what we use at the moment. It was purely light. The underground space obviously would have been dark, but somehow the whole area was lit up, but there was no obvious light source. So it kind of points towards like a sophistication in building technology that we don't have access to at the moment. So going back to the shape and form of buildings, you have all these elements that we're used to, like columns and turrets and archways. And then again, in the modern sense, we always view them as a decorative thing, a decorative flourish. You would have a function, a practical function, but it was an aesthetic thing. But again, are there deeper reasons for why they look like that? Is there a technology, a mechanism behind it? Again, going back to conspiratorial theories again, a lot of these buildings are quite similar to the human body, as above, so below, that whole mantra. And, there's a lot of people, including myself, have the opinion that the human body is being purposefully degraded, like it's being dulled down with the use of electromagnetic pollution, chemicals in the water, chemicals in the food. We're living essentially in this toxic soup, which deeply affects the human body and sort of severs that connection a lot with cosmic forces, a higher power potentially, and also just cause disease and illness, and generally makes people feel quite agitated and creates anxiety and depression. So I think that's a very real thing that's being purposely done. And so, is that the same with some of the architecture in the buildings? Have they purposely been, this kind of more spiritual, higher connection, and their reason for existing, has that been suppressed on purpose? And looking again at that link, how potentially these structures are emulating nature, emulating the human body in a certain way. We can look at the human head and the idea of a crown chakra that kind of creates our connection. It's our antenna to the cosmos. And looking at the shape of some of these domed buildings, and again, they have the antenna, the spike that I talked about earlier in terms of the crosses or the crescents or the moons or the stars, like an area which traditionally people see as being some kind of grounding implement for lightning. But again, is there a deeper thing going on here? It's almost like some of these buildings with the dome and the kind of the metal antennas at the top act like some kind of crown. And then you can then obviously start to look at royalty within a lot of cultures around the world wearing crowns in Europe, and also in other areas, Southeast Asia. They have a prevalence within spiritual circles and also royalty wearing crowns. And I think in Hindu it's called Makuta. It's a really bad pronunciation. But they have similar crowns in other regions in Southeast Asia, from Indonesia, Thailand. Ancient Egyptian cultures as well were quite prevalent. A lot of statues with people with long, pointy or domed-headed headwear. So are these crowns harnessing cosmic energy some way? Is it a way to kind of harness and advance spirituality within these, royalty, members of royalty? And our buildings, really the shape and form, especially with the domes, just emulating that whole process, but just on a larger scale. But onto other architectural anomalies, and this is the first time I've ever heard of this one. When I started to research this, this is completely new to me, and I found it really intriguing. But apparently, I've been to Ireland a few times, mainly sort of around the Dublin region, and also kind of Northern Ireland to Belfast, but that's kind of it. But apparently around Ireland, there's a lot of what are called round towers, and they're scattered around the landscape. And some of them are aligned to constellations and various stars. There's a book that I'm probably going to order, but it's written by Dr. Philip Callahan, and the book is called Paramagnetism, Rediscovering Nature's Secret Force of Growth. And this is a quote from this book, and it said, "I discovered that the round towers are indeed high tower ELF radio antenna paragrammatic amplifiers. More astonishing yet, I discovered that the ancient Irish monks of the 5th to the 9th centuries were rock and tenor radio engineers. So again, like with the pyramids, it's just another incidence of potential evidence that kind of points towards these using a particular technology which harnesses material in terms of stone, the landscape in terms of the ley lines, the Earth's energy, and also kind of cosmic energy as well, to create some sort of energy, some kind of paramagnetic force, and then it amplifying it out for what reason we are unsure. But it could be to do again with purifying the landscape for spiritual advancement. I mean, who knows? But it's just another thread of evidence to kind of point towards this sort of technology existing, and that we have no idea how it works at the moment. There's also speculation in terms of how these round Irish towers actually operate, and the fact that they can be tuned by raising and lowering the soil at the base of the actual kind of tower itself. But again, how the energy is used is a complete mystery. But it just seems such a basic technique, just changing the shape of the space inside, obviously then in some way affects how the energy is manipulated. I'm not actually sure what particular material that some of these round towers were made with. But again, we kind of look at materials such as quartz, granite, limestone. People sometimes have the opinion that, these materials are chosen for, maybe their aesthetics, the way they look, or because, literally it's within the local area. But is there a deeper reasoning, a deeper thought process that goes behind, choosing some of these materials because of their properties? And it's known that quartz actually can hold information. You can actually store information in quartz. And red brick as well has a high iron content and therefore can store energy. So again, this is acting as some kind of battery. And like we mentioned with the pyramids as well, granite gives off a certain amount of radiation as well, and that could be harnessed in some way with these ancient technologies. So places like stone circles, a lot of the materials that they used tended not to be in the local area. They tended to import the stone from large distances, obviously because they had particular properties that were inherent that needed to be used in order for the mechanism to work. So yeah, this is quite a common thing that a lot of the stone circles, the stone is found elsewhere, obviously because the local stone just won't operate in the way that they want it to. So again, with stone circles, there's very much like it's creating an energetic component, which you're still not completely aware of how it works really. But what are some of the energies that potentially these buildings or constructions are utilizing? I mean, initially you get, telluric currents, ley lines, which are perceived to be the meridians of the planet. Obviously you get meridians in the human body. So again, as above, so below. This is kind of well known to us. And we can look at the atmospheric energy as well, natural static charge, which is present in the atmosphere. Some people are calling it atmospheric etheric energy, AEE, which is a subtle force of nature. And I was reading this blog post and it was quite fascinating. And it was making a connection between this atmospheric etheric energy and dark matter, which is this pervasive, like strange substance which seems to elude conventional physics and scientists. This is what one of the core functions, what they tell us the core function of is of the Large Hadron Collider in CERN. And I thought it was an interesting idea, because the scientists are trying to look for this matter, which they, through their mathematics, can see that's there, but they can't see it physically, practically. And is there a correlation between this energy that some of these buildings and stone circles and ancient architecture, is that what potentially is being harnessed is atmospheric etheric energy, and that's what dark matter is? I mean, I thought that was a fascinating point. What makes it tragically funny is that scientists are wasting potentially billions of dollars on this CERN thing. Maybe they just need to talk to their local dowser who could sort of talk them through some of these energies, what they're looking for. I mean, it's a thought. Another trend recently that I've really noticed on the internet to do with gardening and growing vegetables and agriculture, etc., is a thing called electroculture. And it very much correlates to the idea some of the architectural buildings, potentially harnessing some of these cosmic energies. And this is quite similar to what electroculture is, where it's basically harnessing atmospheric etheric energy, and then using it to grow fruit and veg and other vegetation. And some people are claiming it increases yields by 100 to 300%, and also eliminates the need for pesticides and fertilizer because it kind of purifies the soil and creates an amazing environment for these plants to grow, essentially. And how this is practically done, I mean, I don't know a huge amount of it, but what I can see through some of these posts and the information people are putting on Facebook, etc., on these groups, is that you're creating like a copper aerial, which you essentially stick into the ground. And it's pretty simple. Then that radial aerial then just emits the energy into the ground of the soil and then affects the growing of the vegetation. I mean, this could be a huge solution in, creating crops and food that isn't poisoned, that isn't tainted by pesticides or herbicides, but obviously there's going to be people who are going to be pushed against this sort of technology because at the end of the day, the bankers, the money men aren't going to make the money selling these weak seeds and selling these solutions in terms of like pesticides and herbicides to kill all these. And why would they want to introduce a system which basically cuts them out and where they can grow crops that are incredibly strong and resilient without all of this like chemical use? As a researcher, you're kind of looking at all these shards of information that are scattered across, concerning ley lines, earth energies, cosmic energies, the construction and form and shape of architecture and how that affects the landscape and humanity as a whole. Who has this hidden suppressed knowledge? Is it bloodline families? Is it transglobal covert forces, military industrial complexes, the Vatican, the Freemasons? Maybe all of them are in cahoots and have access to this type of knowledge and are trying to suppress it and use it against us in various forms. A good example of a worldwide spanning organization would be the Freemasons, who operate in daylight, in kind of full view of everyone, but there is a hidden aspect to them. Obviously, it has the giggle factor. People perceive it as being like a business networking club where they have sort of silly handshakes and roll their trouser leg up and they have strange rituals. But for the most part, people perceive them as being completely benign and not a threat at all. And from my point of view, I probably think a lot of the people that are actually part of this organization are like that, are probably quite nice people who just want to do well for their community. But it's maybe the upper echelons, when you go higher up the hierarchical structure, maybe this is where some of the real kind of deep knowledge is kind of hidden. And they're also maybe potentially serving a master that's a lot darker than people think. There's a lot of speculations in terms of the Freemasons' activity within general architecture as a whole, but then also the planning of cities and towns across the world. Obviously, the dominant material for some of these ancient buildings has been stone, and stone is worked by stonemasons. And that's kind of the origins of the Freemasons. They were a guild of stonemasons, and they were the builders and constructors of some of these buildings. And, you can look at it, maybe these original stonemasons had a lot of knowledge to do with ley lines and energy and cosmic forces in order to design and construct these edifices. So particularly in the UK and other places of Europe, you can cast an eye at some of the churches and cathedrals again and looking at places of worship. But again, what else has been going on within these forms of architecture in terms of some of the technologies we've been discussing? And how much has been suppressed by this organization, the Freemason? How much information do they still hold in their vaults and have, knowledge of at the higher echelons of the organization? A good example of, Masonic architecture and city planning, people look towards Washington, D.C. in the United States and see it as a huge Masonic manifestation of some of their belief systems and understanding of, ley lines and energy lines. And it's clear for everyone to see in daylight. There's a lot of goat head symbolism, owl-like symbolism embossed within the city streets and pathways, which are very much visible from a bird's eye point of view. If you kind of search for photographs online, it's there, you can see it. And you can't deny some of the genuine symbolism that's there in our faces. Further to this, there's a lot of information concerning the actual placement of these buildings, these artifacts of power in the United States, and how they may have been placed on very potent energy lines And not this is not just segregated to the United States and Washington D.C., but other kind of places of power around the world. And again, you have to speculate. Are they harnessing power? Is this part of the maintaining of the current paradigm? This hierarchical structure very much is held in place by these buildings of power being placed in very key strategic places. And it's maybe not just buildings of political power, maybe kind of military bases. The United States has such great military power across the world and has military bases across the world and could be looked as an occupying force in many ways. I mean, especially across the United Kingdom, there's various, military bases that stem from the United States. And to my knowledge, I don't think the UK has, bases in America. Within the United States, you have states like California, where there's, military bases all over the place in very energetic, potent places. And again, is that on purpose? It's not purely about maybe inhabiting areas maybe that are kind of remote and away from people. That's part of it. But is the placement, put in position of very powerful ley lines to affect the consciousness of the planet? And this is also true of the United Kingdom in Wiltshire, which is a very, very energetic place where you obviously have Stonehenge and you have Avebury stone circles and various other sacred sites. There's a lot of military bases that are kind of peppered around that area. So are these military bases utilizing the earth energies for particular technologies, or are they kind of harnessing and suppressing certain spirituality, certain consciousness through their presence on those ley lines? Some people also have the speculative view. I mean, there's not a lot of information I can find on this, but in terms of abattoirs and slaughterhouses of animals being placed on particular ley lines to, obviously the pain and disharmony it's created by the killing of these animals and the disharmony it creates and then being fed back into the energetic fields, which then just cause divisive nature, cause violence and causes disease through humanity, through the pumping these energies from the pain and suffering of these animals. My own thoughts in terms of like energy potential harvesting of humanity, I've sort of pondered a lot, and this is a lot of my own thought in terms of modern city structures and how much human energy is harvested in cities, particularly when people are there to work, etc. And the epitome of modern city and town planning is the grid system, which is obviously a very blocky way of approaching, town planning and is perceived to be easier to navigate. You have cities in the United States, Australia, all using this same straight line methodology. And it's a real movement away from natural principles in terms of like soft curves and undulating kind of pathways. I've worked quite frequently in sort of quite high density areas of London and in also quite tall, like high buildings. And I can't think about the energetic component of this, like all of these people beavering away, working away, and the amount of potential energy they're creating, like kind of psychic or spiritual energy. And is there a way, is that being harnessed in some way, either by the building itself or the placement where it is in the land? And when you start to look at the city grid system and the building, it starts to really look like an electrical circuitry, like a printed circuit. I mean, there is some information out there which looks at sports venues, huge venues, and you have this collective attention of this crowd, maybe like 80 or 90,000 people crammed into a really small space. And they're all concentrating on this one thing. And then especially if that event is televised as well, that's, multiplied around the world. You could have millions or billions. I mean, particularly like the World Cup or the World Cup Football Cup or the Super Bowl in the United States have huge television viewing figures as well. And it's just like, again, is that attention? Is that energetic human component? Is that harnessed in some way against us? I even started to consider war memorials because in my experience, every time I see a war memorial, it seems to be in a relatively energetic place. And, a few times a year, you have gatherings of people around these monuments, again, with a certain intention gathered around. And then how much is that energy being harvested? I mean, in the sort of example of Brighton and Ditchling, they have war memorials and both are in relatively energetic areas and quite near to former potential standing stones as well. And in Scotland, which I've been to frequently, there's a small town called Oban, which is a kind of a springboard to a lot of the islands on the west coast of Scotland. And I noticed there was a war memorial, and it was right next to this huge standing stone. So again, every time I see a war memorial, it was always in a very energetic place, which I've always found very fascinating. So, in conclusion, we have literally jumped all over the map, both in time and space and thought. I've had some very scattered thoughts. I always find Graham Hancock, the sort of alternative writer of archaeology, he always talks about humans being a species with amnesia, and we've forgotten so much. And we have so much to rediscover. And I think he's right on the nail. I think that's kind of what we're dealing with at the moment. And some of it has been lost through the sands of time. But again, I think there's been a lot of manipulation and suppression of knowledge as well. But this suppression, I think, still continues. I mean, you have a lot of wars centered on the Middle East. These are ancient cultures in Iraq and Syria. And there's been a lot of things in the news, a few years ago, of ancient artifacts and various bits of architecture being decimated. And it's just more knowledge that's being lost. And it's like, how much of that is on purpose? They like to blame it on various dissident kind of terrorist groups and stuff. But how much of that is, the powers that be, again, just trying to wipe humanity's, knowledge and understanding of their own history? From my own point of view, it just feels like the task for humanity is huge. We've created, living environments which are quite detrimental, I think, to our own health and communities, and cause disease and a lot of harm. And we have so much to remember and so much to put right in terms of, the materials we're using in building, the consciousness of the placement, the form, the shape. I mean, it's just everything concerning it needs to be completely rethought and redesigned. So the task is humongous. But at least I think there's an awareness that's kind of percolating through into the collective. And hopefully, the future kind of understanding this and rebuilding will be an exciting one. Well, that wraps it up. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Reconsider Simon. As always, this has been great. You can catch me on the internet on reconsidersimon.com. You can find me on YouTube, on Rumble and Odyssey, and also on various podcast platforms as well. And I will bid you a good night or good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.